If you were told that a single, simple marker in your body, something as ordinary as your blood type, might be a faint echo of a life lived under a very different sky, would you listen? If you have blood type O, what if you carry more than a genetic label, a thread that, when traced through the archive of Edgar Cayce's readings, seems to line up with a set of experiences, dreams, and gifts Cayce associated with souls who once walked the lands called Atlantis? Before we rush to conclusions, understand this. That connection is a hypothesis, an invitation to explore patterns in Cayce's thousands of trance readings and in the living testimonies of people who carry particular dream motifs. It is not a medical claim, not a genealogical proof. It is a curiosity raised by archival work, oral history, and spiritual interpretation. Edgar Cayce, known in the 20th century as the Sleeping Prophet, left behind a vast archive of trance readings, carefully catalogued by the organization that now holds his papers. In room after room of yellowed transcripts, volunteers and researchers have found recurring images: the city of stone, crystals that store and transmit energy, temples of water, priests who worked with healing energies, and people who awoke with skills they could not explain. In many of these readings, Cayce described prior incarnations, soul patterns, and dreams as windows to past lives. He organized one practical framework that keeps returning in the archives: 7 types of spiritually significant dreams. Those types, when read as a set, act like diagnostic markers, not in the scientific sense, but as a map Cayce construed for how soul memory reveals itself. Here one of those maps through a single case. In reading number 25,336, Cayce worked with a woman named Margaret, who came to him haunted by a persistent image. She would find herself falling, then suddenly flying, not as an accident of imagination, but as a repeated, evolved narrative that felt like a message. The dream itself shifted over time, at first a terror, then a glorious flight over coastlines and ruined spires. Cayce's interpretation, within his own frame, did not treat the dream as mere wish fulfillment or symptom. Instead, he traced it to a soul memory of an earlier life in which Margaret had been connected to a culture that prized aerial movement and symbolic ascents, priests and initiates whose rites involved leaving the body in vision to enter higher halls. Afterwards, Margaret reported a subtle reorientation in her waking life, an uncanny ease with metaphor, an attraction to places of height and horizon, and a tendency to feel grounded only when serving others in visible, practical ways. Her dreams became, in Cayce's language, a signpost, not a prophecy that bound her to a single identity, but an activation of tendencies that required moral direction. That case introduces the first of Cayce's 7 dream types, the flight dream, which often indicates the soul's readiness to transcend habitual limits. Modern correlates show up in people who spend their lives building bridges, literal or metaphorical, between ideas, technologies, and communities. They are the ones who imagine the future before it arrives, and who sometimes feel lonely because the rest of the world still lives on the lower planes of consensus. Contrast that with another profile Cayce recorded repeatedly, the water healing dream. James Thompson is one of the people in the files whose dreams were drenched in sensory detail: the cool, living touch of water, the whisper of tiled baths, the slow, focused work of tending wounds, not only of the body, but of the spirit. In sessions where Cayce read for James, the imagery resolved into narratives of temple service, in which water played a technical and symbolic role. These were not fantasies of spa-like comfort. They were visions of energetic practice, channels of cleansing, stones arranged to focus healing, breath-synchronized rituals. The waking echo in James's life was a facility with therapies, an attraction to work that combined hands-on care with an understanding of subtle fields, massage, hydrotherapy, and later in his life, a resonance with holistic forms of medicine. Cayce framed this as the soul reactivating a set of abilities and responsibilities, gifts that must be steered by ethical intent. Then there's the case that centers the argument that will guide us through this series, David Kahn. His readings are among the most striking in Cayce's corpus for anyone interested in ancient civilization motifs. David's dreams, recorded in the files with dense notes about architecture, sound, and light, were not merely memories of place, they were immersive rehearsals, corridors of basalt and crystal, instruments of light that hummed with purpose, priests who calibrated mental states as carefully as modern engineers calibrate circuits. The dreamscape Cayce described for David read like the blueprint of a techno-spiritual culture. Structures that amplified consciousness, materials that stored information in crystalline lattices, and healers whose tuning of subtle vibrations produced measurable effects on the body. As we trace these three archetypes, flight, water healing, and ancient civilization dreams, a pattern begins to emerge. People who carry these dream motifs often report an affinity for certain life patterns, an ease with emerging tech, a calling to healing arts, recurring visions of antiquity that do not fit learned history but do recur as vivid embodied memory. Cayce's interpretation was consistent. These are signs of souls re-entering the world with particular missions and with residue from complex, sometimes traumatic past lives. It is within that context that some contemporary researchers raise a speculative question. Could there be a biological correlate to these soul patterns? Could a marker as mundane as blood type be one of those faint echoes? The suggestion, whispered among small circles of dreamers and Cayce enthusiasts, is that blood type O, more often than chance might dictate, appears among those reporting Atlantean dream motifs. That observation has been circulated as anecdote, as an interview detail, and in private research notes. It is important to say plainly, this is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Cayce himself did not catalog blood types as a primary indicator. The archives do not provide medical proof linking blood type to soul origin. What the archives do contain are patterns in narrative, behavior, and self-report that invite exploration. Before the exploration deepens, we need to step back to the method. How did Cayce come to these claims in the first place? His readings were delivered in a sleeping trance, in which he entered an altered state and described images, past life stories, and health suggestions with remarkable detail. He referred often to the Akashic records, a term he used to reference a universal record of soul experience accessible in that state. The readings were catalogued, cross-referenced, and preserved. For those who revere them, the consistency across thousands of readings creates a form of internal evidence. Motifs recur, names reappear, and certain ethical lines, the call towards service and the orientation to Christ consciousness, appear again and again. For the skeptical seeker, the readings offer a trove of narrative that can be analyzed for coherence, cultural bias, and psychological resonance. The 7 dream types Cayce identified operate like a language. To learn that language is to notice the same root images cropping up across decades of readings. The types may be summarized here as a working framework, not as an exhaustive taxonomy, but as a useful guide. The flight dream, ascension, transcendence. The water healing dream, temple of cleansing, therapeutic practice. The ancient civilization dream, temples, technology, priestly training. The deceased communication dream, okayed transitions and messages. The prophetic dream, future insight and premonition. The hands-on healing scenario, the dream that activates therapeutic skill. And the Christ consciousness revelation, direct encounters with higher moral vision and spiritual authority. Each type carries a different invitation in waking life. For some, a call to heal. For others, a call to invent, to lead, to bear witness. Margaret's recurring flight dream is a neat example because it spans a dramatic interior arc. At first, the image is terrifying, falling unchecked. For many, falling is a classic anxiety dream, lack of control, fear of failure, collapse.
But when the dream evolves into deliberate flight, something else is happening psychologically and spiritually. Mastery of fear, liberation of imagination, a readiness to carry insight outward. For Margaret, the flight became linked to service. When she woke and encountered situations that demanded practical help, community organizing, caring for neighbors after storms, she reported a new patience and a surprising resourcefulness. Cayce's interpretation framed the dream as the soul's message. The client had been a member of an order that used visionary states for communal guidance. The implication is not that everyone who dreams of flying is Atlantean. Rather, it is that this dream pattern can be a signpost pointing to a repertoire of gifts and obligations. James Thompson's water healing dreams show the same logic in a different register. Water, as symbol, spans human cultures, but in Cayce's files, it often bears a technical charge. The therapists in the ancient temples Cayce described understood how water could be structured through channels, stones, and sounds to affect the body and spirit. James's waking life gave him tools that mapped onto this dream language, a touch that comforted, a capacity to hold troubled people through slow, ritualized care. In some readings, Cayce actually advised that such people cultivate practices that harmonized breath, touch, and attention. The ethical line is clear. Gifts become dangerous when disconnected from service. They bear a responsibility to heal rather than exploit. David Kahn's material is the most cinematic. Crystalline consoles glowing in temple halls, geometric patterns that refract sound into healing, priests who tuned stones as a musician tunes strings. Cayce's telling is evocative and precise. In the archive, Kahn's dreams read like a catalog of a lost technology. Not technology as a gadget, but technology as trained attention and material understanding integrated into daily life. His modern gifts included a fluency with devices and systems, a mind that traced patterns of relation the way others traced shopping lists. People like David report not only memory, but an inner recognition. They see modern machines as descendants of those ancient instruments, and they feel a moral tug to channel that affinity toward building rather than destroying. These three cases illustrate something crucial. Cayce did not romanticize the past, nor did he proclaim an untroubled return of an ancient golden age. If anything, he warned that many who once lived in advanced cultures carried unresolved material patterns, attachments to power, to control, to exploitation of life that had to be worked through in present incarnations. The Atlantean narrative in Cayce's telling is both gift and responsibility. The advanced technology of Atlantis was not merely material, it was embedded in social and spiritual structures. When that balance broke down, so did civilization.
Those souls returned, according to Cayce, with gifts that were double-edged. The modern test is whether those gifts are used to heal and to serve. You can see why, then, people look for patterns beyond the purely psychological. If a cluster of dream motifs, behavioral tendencies, and vocational attractions recurs, might there be a way to map those clusters to something more tangible? That is the speculative nudge behind the blood type question. Imagine a circle of people who report strong ancient civilization dreams and who also report an ease with certain technologies and a calling to healing modalities. If many among that circle also happen to be blood type O, it's easy for curiosity to turn into a tentative hypothesis. Perhaps there is an overrepresentation worth researching. Notice how cautious that sentence must be. Cayce's files, as rich as they are, do not provide genetic testing or medical data. The archives report lived experience, symbolic imagery, and Cayce's interpretive frames. Any link to blood types would have to come from careful, multidisciplinary research, geneticists, anthropologists, archivists, and careful statisticians, not from isolated anecdotes. The responsible way to hold the idea is as a starting point for inquiry, not as a concluding headline. And yet, the pattern is compelling enough to merit structured attention. To understand why, we need to situate Cayce's dream types within a broader logic of soul memory. For Cayce, dreams were not idle fantasies, but transmissions from a deeper self, often labeled in his language as the soul, which carried through lifetimes. The 7 dream types acted like registers. Some activate abilities, some open doors to memory, some call the dreamer to moral correction. When a person brings multiple dream types in play, imagine someone who alternates between water healing visions and technologically detailed ancient civilization dreams, who occasionally sees Jesus or experiences life review sequences. That composite profile stands out. Take another file from the archives, Mary Patterson, who, throughout her life, experienced vivid communications in which deceased relatives came with instructions and comfort. In Cayce's reading for Mary, the deceased communication dreams served a rehabilitation function. They were not random visits, but targeted interventions by the soul community to guide her through particular crises. Mary's public life became one of presence, counseling the bereaved, holding quiet vigils, and teaching others how to listen in the silence between breaths. Her gifts were stabilizing. They oriented others toward reconciliation. Eleanor Walsh represents the prophetic dream thread. Her dreams cut forward, sometimes aligning with events that later unfolded. Within Cayce's framework, prophetic dreams are not guaranteed forecasts of exact outcomes. They are warnings and invitations to change course.
Cayce frequently cautioned that prophecy carries with it the possibility of amendment through human choice. In Eleanor's life, the prophetic motif matured into an ethic, to speak truth carefully and to advocate for the vulnerable, precisely because the foresight she was given demanded responsibility rather than self-promotion. The hands-on healing scenarios, the 6th type, appear in dreams where the dream itself trains the waking hand. Robert Chen, in his file, dreamt of working with stones and sounds in a temple context. When he later encountered modern therapeutic practices, he learned quickly because the dream had already primed his motor memory and his imagination. It is one thing to feel called to a practice, it is another to find that the body remembers how to do it. Cayce used such accounts to argue that soul memory can precondition skill. Across these types, the recurring refrain in Cayce's counsel is the same: use gifts for service. He returned again and again to Christ-centered language, not necessarily as denominational doctrine, but as a moral and spiritual compass. In his readings, Christ consciousness is less a brand and more an organizing principle, an orientation toward love, sacrifice, and communal well-being. Cayce's insistence was that spiritual gifts unmoored from that ethic become sources of harm. Whether the gift manifests as technological acuity, healing touch, or prophetic sight, the moral test is the same. Why does this matter for someone who simply checks their blood type and sees an O? Because the speculative hypothesis that blood type O might be more prevalent among people with Atlantean dream motifs flips a private curiosity into a public question about stewardship. If you are blood type O and you find that you resonate with certain dream images, what then? Do you pursue development of those gifts? Do you ignore them? Do you warn others? Cayce's files suggest a third way: disciplined exploration paired with accountability. At this point in the narrative, it helps to step into practical terrain. Cayce's work was not only descriptive, he offered practices for aligning with gifts. He recommended, repeatedly, disciplined attunement, keeping a dream journal, establishing a daily routine of quiet meditation or prayer to sharpen the receptive faculties, cultivating service as the principal field in which gifts mature. The suggestion is methodical. Record your dreams without judgment. Look for patterns over months, not days. Find a community that can hold your experiences without sensationalizing them, and always test gifts through tangible acts of service. There is also a scientific responsibility woven into this approach. If you are intrigued by the possibility of a biological correlate, consult professionals. Geneticists and medical researchers can help you understand what blood type is and what it is not.
Blood type tells us about antigens on red blood cells, markers of immune response and compatibility with complex historical distributions shaped by population movement, disease exposure, and chance. It does not, in current medical science, tell us about soul origin. Claiming otherwise would be both irresponsible and damaging. The ethical posture is simple. Explore the spiritual hypothesis with humility and seek empirical expertise for biological questions. Back in the archive, when researchers gather commonalities across cases, they find not a neat checklist, but a gradient of traits. Some people show strong affinities for technology and a kind of intuitive engineering. Others display deep healing instincts. A subset exhibits both. The temptation is to slot people into categories: Atlantean, Lemurian, priest-healer, or scientist. But Cayce himself warned against brittle labels. His focus was always on growth, the soul's opportunity to learn, to repent, and to apply knowledge righteously. This archive-driven humility colors our treatment of the blood type speculation. The hypothesis gains emotional power because many people seek grounding narratives, a lineage that explains their disconnect, a past that legitimizes their present gifts, an ancestry that confers dignity. To be told you might be Atlantean offers both balm and burden. It can comfort by suggesting continuity, but it can also tempt pride. Cayce's moral framing insists on service. It insists that the past is not an entitlement, but a responsibility. So how do we listen, practically? Start small. Begin a dream journal tonight. The prompt doesn't need to be elaborate. When you wake, write the dominant image, the emotion, the setting, and any striking detail: water temperature, the color of a crystal, the sound that accompanied the vision. Do this faithfully for 3 months before drawing patterns. Dreams collect like sediment. Meaning is often found in the layering rather than in a single dramatic episode. Pair your journal with an attunement practice that aligns mind and body. Cayce recommended quiet time in the morning and evening for prayer or meditation.
The practice is less about summoning visions and more about sharpening discrimination, learning to tell the difference between ego dreams, wishful thinking, trauma repetition, and what Cayce called soul downloads. Make service the test of authenticity. If a gift makes you likelier to help the vulnerable, not to escape responsibility, it is moving toward health. If it tempts you to isolate, exploit, or dominate, it needs recalibration. Community matters. Cayce's readings emphasize accountability. Seek mentors, spiritual directors, or therapeutic professionals who respect your experiences but also challenge you. A gift without accountability is like a powerful tool held by an unskilled hand. In the files, many healers who went astray did so because they lacked community constraints.
The antidote is simple. Build relationships that demand integrity. These practical steps prepare the ground for a deeper inquiry into the Atlantean narrative itself and the reasons why blood type speculation finds fertile soil in certain communities. Before we go there, into the heart of Cayce's claims about Atlantean incarnations, the technology of the temples, and the karmic responsibilities attached to such past lives, we should pause to consider a human detail that threads through many of the readings: the afterlife and the life review. Across the Cayce corpus, dying was often not an abrupt severing, but a process. Several readings describe what modern researchers term the life review, a panoramic reliving of one's choices, wounds, and impacts on others. This is a profoundly moralizing motif. In cases where people return to incarnate again, the archives suggest that the life review often highlighted specific failures, misuse of power, neglect of the vulnerable, or a surrender to materialism. Those errors, when traced back to purported Atlantean lives, were not always grand crimes, but often accumulated small acts of injustice that, in aggregate, produced collapse. For Cayce, the moral consequence was persistent. The soul returns to repair rather than to repeat. This moral lens shapes Cayce's counseling about addiction, a topic he addressed with frequency and compassion. Addiction, in his framework, is not merely chemical dependency, it is a spiritual dislocation where the soul seeks to self-medicate old pain. He approached each case with practical suggestions, dietary, environmental, and spiritual, but his deeper counsel was about reintegration, reconnecting the person to community, to purpose, and to love. In that sense, the Atlantean theme becomes ethically charged. If someone with an Atlantean past returns with gifts and also with patterns of escapism or power misuse, the therapeutic work is to reorient those patterns towards healing and service. That reorientation is central to why the speculative blood type idea triggers such strong responses. For those who see themselves in Cayce's narratives, the notion that a biological marker might be a sign of inherited mission amplifies both hope and fear. Hope that a lineage explains special capacities, fear that the same lineage might carry inherited liabilities. The practical response, again, is the same. Test gifts by how they affect others. Use them to alleviate suffering. Let moral consequence be the barometer of authenticity. We are approaching the point where the narrative must turn inward towards those cases in the archive that most explicitly connect to Atlantis as a cultural memory. The detailed temple scenes, the accounts of crystalline devices, the descriptions of priestly roles. These are the readings that most draw researchers into the Atlantean hypothesis, where the dream images are not generic symbols, but specific techno-spiritual artifacts.
They are also the readings that compel the blood type question, because they cluster around people who, in modern life, display certain predilections.
Before we descend into that archive-rich zone, before naming the specific technological descriptions, the ritual forms, and the dramatic life arcs that Cayce recorded, take a moment to hold three truths steady. First, Cayce's readings are archival narratives, not laboratory data. They provide patterns of experience, not certainties. Second, any link between blood type and soul origin is an exploratory hypothesis and must be treated with scientific humility. Third, Cayce's ethical insistence remains our guiding light. Gifts are organisms of service, not trophies of distinction. With those guardrails in place, the next set of readings will take us deeper into the architecture of Cayce's Atlantean accounts, the temples of light, the roles of priest-healers, and the ways those past life functions re-emerge as predispositions in modern people who report strong dream motifs. We will examine further cases where the dream imagery is so detailed that it reads like technical specification, and we will listen for the ways Cayce threads moral correction into technical description. We will also begin to trace the anecdotal pattern that has led some to raise the blood type O hypothesis, its origins in private research notes, the communities where it circulates, and the cautionary responses from medical professionals. What you can carry forward now is a practice. Start recording. Begin with tonight's dream. Note any recurring water, flight, or temple imagery. Notice if your waking life inclines you toward healing, toward devices and systems, or toward moral leadership. And if in the course of that journaling you discover you are blood type O and that your dreams tilt toward the ancient civilization pattern, hold that discovery lightly, as a point of investigation rather than as a headline that defines you. There will be time to examine case after case from the archives, to consider how Cayce's notion of Atlantean return is structured, and to ask whether the biological speculation warrants deeper study. For now, keep recording, keep serving, and keep the ethical compass in your hand. Soon we will read the files that describe the temples of the Atlantean orders in granular detail, the way sound and light were used, the social structures of the priesthood, and the specific vocational echoes that modern individuals carry. We will listen to cases where the dream is not just evocative, but operative, a dream that teaches an action the waking body can replicate. Those readings are where the archival evidence feels most alive, and where the line between spiritual memory and modern vocation becomes most porous. We will follow those threads, but before we do, remember Cayce's repeated admonition. Knowledge without service becomes judgment. Gifts without love become harm. Keep that admonition close as we proceed.
The next files in the archive pull the reader deeper into architecture that reads less like myth and more like a lived, engineered environment. In those pages, the temples are not simply symbolic spaces. They are described as instruments, rooms shaped to carry sound, corridors that bent light in precise angles, vaults lined with crystalline forms whose surfaces were patterned like musical scores. Cayce's descriptions of these places often come with sensory specificity. The taste of the air when a chamber opened, the way a low-frequency tone made the hairs along a forearm stand at attention, the electric scent of stirred mineral dust when a console was activated. That specificity is what convinces some researchers that these accounts are not idle allegory. It is also what makes the Atlantean material hazardous to romanticize. Techniques and social structures are always embedded in a culture. The same tools that raised life could be misapplied to control it. One reading in particular, remembered across several client files, some of which reference architects, priests, and technicians, describes a hall of sound in which attendants tuned long, graduated bars of stone. The bars were positioned like strings across the hall, When struck or vibrated with breath and vocalized vowels, they produced standing patterns of resonance that, according to the material in the files, altered blood flow, reduced fever, and in one account, eased the grip of mortal pain long enough to allow a patient to pass without panic. To a modern ear, this reads like proto-resonance therapy. To Cayce and his clients, it read like a familiar craft, a technical competence handed down through initiatory lines. Practitioners who later reported waking affinities for sound, for instrument making, or for therapeutic rhythm sometimes placed themselves in that lineage. For them, the memory felt less like fantasy and more like muscle memory, an unbidden facility with harmonic systems and an impatience with noise that lacked purpose. David Kahn's file expands this theme with a particular kind of clarity. His dreams take place in chambers that are both chapel and laboratory. He witnesses priests calibrating discs of pale crystal until the light through them forms a map of pattern behaviors across a human body. He hears mention of keys and intervals that must be maintained to prevent dissonance in a society built around tuned field relationships. In one sequence, Kahn watches a technician alter the pitch of an apparatus, and the effect is immediate. Swollen tissue in a patient reduces, a fevered brow cools, a child cries but then calms. In his waking life, Kahn reports an intuitive grasp of systems. He sees traffic flows as problems of harmonics. He reads circuit schematics like chants. The archive records that Cayce counseled Kahn to ground these affinities in service, to avoid the temptation of mastery for mastery's sake.
The admonition is oddly modern. With power comes the need for ethical governance. Robert Chen's case shows how a dream can be operative. In a temple sequence, he dreams of hands arranging stones in concentric patterns around a pool. The stones are inscribed in a script he cannot read, but his fingers move with an uncanny surety. When he later takes up therapeutic practice in the modern world, finding his way into massage and sound therapy, his hands know how to find tension, how to coax tissue into release with minimal force. In the file, Cayce interprets the dream as training. The mind learns pattern, the body learns gesture. The waking life reclaims both when the circumstances allow. The practical consequence is important. If soul memory can prime a skill set, treating that skill with humility and ethical oversight becomes crucial. Martha Johnson's reading is quieter but equally potent. Her recurring vision is less about instruments and more about presence, a luminous figure who offers not doctrine but a way of seeing. Her dream culminates in an encounter that Cayce frames as a Christ consciousness revelation, an experience in which moral clarity replaces competence as the central virtue. After these visions, Martha's life cohered around acts of radical service, tending to prisoners, organizing food drives, sitting with people in their final hours. Her gift was not an aptitude for devices, but a witness that steadied others. Cayce's files use language of balance. Technological capacity without an aligning ethical light is incomplete. Martha's example becomes a counterweight in the archive, a reminder that the highest skill is sometimes the simplest, to love. As we move through these files, the pattern of gifts and responsibilities repeats in variegated forms. The dream imagery ties to vocational proclivities. Those who dream of water bring healing hands to care work. Those who dream of crystalline lenses bring intuition to systems and devices. Those who dream of flight bring vision to social structures. The reading is not deterministic, it offers a suggestive mapping. People may have predispositions, but they must choose how to use them. This is the moment where the speculative connective tissue around blood type O grows louder in certain communities. Let us be explicit and careful. The archives do not speak in blood types. Cayce's work predates widespread public conversation about blood type personality theories, and his sessions were not medical gene surveys. The blood type O idea is a contemporary overlay, an attempt by some researchers and dream groups to correlate an easily known biological marker with the narrative clusters we have been tracing. In private research notes, at conferences among Cayce enthusiasts, and in informal surveys circulated in spiritual communities, an anecdotal impression has taken shape. Among those who report strong Atlantean imagery, a recognizable share report having blood type O.
Why would such a pattern, if it exists, be compelling? Several non-conspiratorial explanations offer themselves. First, blood type O is one of the most common global phenotypes. In many populations, it is numerically prevalent. That prevalence alone makes it statistically likely to appear often in any sample. Second, cultural narratives bias memory and reporting. If a community expects to find a biological marker, members who fit that marker are more likely to participate in discussions, creating sampling skew. Third, there are plausible but entirely speculative mechanisms that some lay researchers mention: historical population mixing, selective survival in certain climates, or even folklore that assigned particular temperaments to bloodlines. None of these mechanisms provides proof. They do, however, offer fertile ground for honest inquiry. Because the hypothesis is fragile, the responsible path is to outline how it could be investigated properly. Imagine a study designed by a multidisciplinary team: geneticists familiar with population genetics, anthropologists who understand cultural reporting biases, statisticians who can parse cluster effects, and archivists who can reliably code dream motifs in the Cayce corpus. Such a study would require anonymized data, robust sampling across demographics, and a clear guardrail against confirmation bias. It would ask simple questions. Among persons reporting certain dream motifs, does the prevalence of blood type O differ significantly from the general population after controlling for geography, ethnicity, and age? Any result would be an initial observation, not a conclusion. If a difference emerged, the next questions would be causal, not causal. What might explain it? Historical migration patterns? A cultural artifact? Or simply a mirror of the communities participating in the research? None of these methodological steps are glamorous. They are the slow, patient work of standing curiosity up against disciplined method. Yet the temptation to leap, especially with a hypothesis that promises an elegant explanation for deep personal experiences, is strong. Cayce's archive itself cautions against such leaps. His repeated theme is temperance. Seek the truth, but with humility. Test the spirit of a claim by how it affects the vulnerable. If a hypothesis leads to service, it becomes morally useful. If it leads to superiority, it becomes morally dangerous. For viewers who feel personally implicated by the title, if you have blood type O, the ancient Atlantean lineage you carry, there are pragmatic, ethically grounded steps you can take to explore these resonances without adopting a belief as identity. First, if biological verification is a priority, consult a qualified medical professional or a certified laboratory. Blood type is a medical fact that can be obtained through standard testing. Pursue it responsibly and keep privacy in mind.
Second, cultivate the spiritual practices that archive material like Cayce's most frequently recommends: disciplined dream journaling, daily attunement practices, and service as a constant test. These are practical actions that develop discernment more than speculation. A practical program might look like this. Begin by committing to 3 months of recording. Each morning, upon waking, write, briefly but specifically, the dominant dream images, the felt emotion, any sensory details, and a hypothesis about how the image makes sense in your life.
After a month, read the entries for patterns. After 3 months, look for clusters that align with the 7 dream types. If ancient civilization motifs appear, annotate whether they recur with water imagery, flight imagery, or hands-on healing scenes. The simple act of tracking amplifies awareness and reduces the chance that a single dramatic dream becomes a defining narrative. Parallel to journaling, adopt an attunement practice of modest scope, 10 to 20 minutes of quiet at dawn and dusk. Cayce recommended prayer and meditation not as techniques for power, but as methods for discrimination, learning to hear what serves others and what serves ego. Use those minutes to cultivate an openness that is practical. Set an intention to be of service that day. Ask for clarity about one decision, and then watch how small choices align. Keep a log of service actions, an hour spent assisting a neighbor, an email offering mentorship, 10 minutes of active listening with someone in need. Over months, this journal of service will show whether your gifts incline toward help or toward self-aggrandizement. Community oversight is essential. Seek a circle that values both spiritual curiosity and ethical restraint. That circle could be a study group focused on dream work, a therapist who integrates transpersonal approaches, a faith community that holds accountability, or a mentor experienced in integrative healing. The key is that your experiences have temporary witnesses who can ask hard questions with love. What are you doing with this gift? Who benefits? Who is harmed? Let us return briefly to the archive to listen for how Cayce tied these individual practices back into public responsibility. In multiple readings across individuals who reported everything from crystalline instruments to life review audiences, Cayce returned again and again to the same point. The next uses of any gift must repair the social fabric. He spoke often in his sessions about small acts of restitution and large acts of policy. He counseled healers to practice freely with those in need, to avoid charging those who could not afford care, to teach rather than to hoard knowledge. In capitalist modernity, this counsel reads like a direct challenge. Technology can be monetized. It can also be democratized. Cayce's moral prescription was clear: prefer the latter. That ethic frames his counsel on addiction as well.
The archive repeatedly treats addiction through a layered approach: practical measures to support bodily systems, psychological work to address trauma loops, community supports for accountability, and spiritual reconnection to purpose. For someone who believes they carry an Atlantean lineage, the temptation to treat gift as salve for old wounds is poignant. The archive advises the opposite. Gifts rarely heal the self without deliberate accountability. If anything, the presence of strong gifts makes the work of integration more urgent because the potential for harm is amplified. The life review sequences in the files compound this urgency. In several accounts, individuals approaching the thin boundary between life and death experience a sweeping playback, not as judgment, but as illumination. They see, in sequence, how each choice affected others. They feel the pain mirrored back. These experiences are, in Cayce's language, corrective. They are the soul's curriculum. The archive uses these narratives not to terrify, but to instruct. We return to repair what we broke. The Atlantean motif is therefore not a badge of honor, but a charge to stewardship. If we grant the possibility, for the sake of exploration, that some people carry more vivid Atlantean memory than others, what does a life lived in accordance with Cayce's ethic look like? The file-based answer is unsurprising and deeply mundane. It looks like people who use skills to democratize knowledge, engineers who prioritize safe design, healers who train community practitioners, technologists who refuse to weaponize tools, and visionaries who anchor their foresight in tangible acts that reduce suffering. It looks like leaders who choose reparative policy over personal profit. It looks like quiet mornings of prayer and disciplined evenings of recording. A constructive, community-minded response to the blood type speculation is to turn curiosity into service-oriented inquiry. A community research project could be organized that pairs dream coding with volunteering. Volunteers might participate in structured dream reporting, and those who are interested, willing, and informed might also contribute basic anonymized health data for purely statistical analysis. More important than any numerical correlation would be the community ethic cultivated through the process. People learning to support one another's gifts responsibly, regardless of the data's outcome. There are social challenges to this work that merit attention. Human beings are adept at turning lineage into privilege. The temptation to claim Atlantean heritage as a superior origin is both predictable and dangerous. Cayce's consistently reiterated remedy is humility expressed as service. He frames origins as context, not crown. The archive is dense with cautions. Those who claim ancient identities at the expense of compassion find themselves spiritually impoverished.
Use the lineage story to scaffold responsibility. Do not let it become a fortress. We have been careful, repeatedly, to separate archival claims from contemporary speculation. Still, the emotional force of the Atlantean narrative is palpable in many lives. People who find in these images a map for vocation often report profound relief, a narrative coherence that helps them make sense of misfitting tendencies, of technological curiosity, of the compulsion to heal. But relief without discernment can be a trap. That is why the archive's moral center, Christ consciousness in Cayce's language, remains the touchstone. That principle emphasizes repair, sacrifice, and service. It is not a theological imposition, but a moral heuristic. In doubt, choose the action that benefits the weakest person in the room. As the archival narrative winds toward a close, it becomes practical again. For those who want to explore responsibly, here is a consolidated regimen distilled from the files and from the ethical logic that undergirds them. Keep a dream journal for 3 months. Practice daily attunement for 10 to 20 minutes. Volunteer weekly in a context that demands humility and service. Find an accountability circle that can read your experiences without sensationalism. Consult medical professionals if you pursue biological verification. And finally, resist the urge to brand any personal identity around an ancient label. One more caution about community and research is necessary. If you choose to share your blood type and dream materials publicly, be aware of the social consequences. In some pockets, claiming Atlantean lineage is harmless and comforting. In others, it can attract opportunists who promise power or profit. Protect your privacy, set clear boundaries for what you make public, and demand ethical transparency if you participate in any study. If the blood type hypothesis ultimately proves weak or non-existent, the personal practices remain valuable. Dreamcraft, attunement, and service sharpen discernment, increase empathy, and help people direct their talents toward healing. Whether or not an ancestral marker is found, the life you build in response to these impulses, the way you wield curiosity, the humility you cultivate, the hands you lend, will be the moral truth that matters. Now, a brief practical note about language and posture when you speak of these things.
When you discuss the possibility that blood type O might correlate with Atlantean dream patterns, use cautious phrasing. Speak of hypothesis, anecdotal observation, and research question. Avoid definitive statements or accusatory language about others' origins. Remember that science and soul language operate in different registers. Keep those registers distinct in public discourse to avoid conflation that harms both. The archival files close, as many moral corpuses do, on a note that is both sobering and liberating.
If you are listening, if you have blood type O, if you dream of crystal halls, if you feel a steady tug toward restoring what was broken, then answer that invitation, not by claiming a past for prestige, but by committing to present acts of repair. That is the legacy the archive presses on every page, not possession of a story, but the courage to live it well.